The tail gunner who refused to leave his guns at 24,000 feet above Germany, Staff Sergeant Michael Louis Aruth, had no working interphone, no normal oxygen supply, a badly wounded leg, and only one usable machine gun. Then that gun jammed. Behind him, German fighters were preparing another attack. Ahead of him stretched most of the narrow aluminum body of a damaged B-17 flying fortress. Somewhere beyond the cables, oxygen bottles, gun positions, and bomb bay, the pilots were throwing the aircraft through violent, evasive movements. Several crewmen had already mistaken those movements for the beginning of an uncontrolled fall. Believing the bomber was going down, they had jumped over enemy territory. Aruth did not know exactly who remained aboard. He could not ask. His interphone was dead. He had tried to reach emergency oxygen, but the bomber was still under attack. Every second he spent away from the tail left the aircraft undefended. One of his two machine guns had already been disabled. Now the second had stopped firing. Without oxygen at that altitude, a wounded man could lose judgment, coordination, vision, and consciousness within minutes. Aruth's fingers should have become clumsy. His thoughts should have slowed. Instead, he worked on the jam. The German fighter behind him grew larger. Aruth cleared the weapon, swung it toward the attacker, and fired. By the end of the battle, the young tail gunner had destroyed 4 enemy aircraft. He would receive the Distinguished Service Cross for what he did that day. Later storytellers would change parts of the event. Some placed him aboard the wrong bomber. Others claimed he defeated the Luftwaffe by rejecting an official firing manual. A few added unsupported stories about German commanders hunting him personally. None of those additions were necessary. The truth was stronger. Aruth was wounded. His oxygen failed. His communications failed. Men left the aircraft. One gun was disabled, and the last gun jammed. He stayed. Kimbolton. In the summer of 1943, the airfield at Kimbolton stood among the farms and villages of Cambridgeshire, England. Flat fields surrounded the runways. Hedgerows divided the countryside, and church towers could be seen beyond the perimeter. At dawn, however, Kimbolton did not resemble a peaceful farming district. Fuel trucks moved between aircraft dispersal areas. Ground crews worked beneath wings and engine nacelles. Armorers loaded ammunition belts and prepared bombs. Mechanics inspected tires, cables, hydraulic systems, control surfaces, and the patched aluminum skin of aircraft that had already survived combat. Kimbolton was home to the 379th Bombardment Group of the United States Army Air Forces. Its crews flew B-17 flying fortresses as part of the 8th Air Force's daylight bombing campaign. Their targets included aircraft factories, airfields, transportation centers, and industrial facilities supporting the German war effort. A B-17 normally carried 10 men. The bombardier and navigator worked in the nose. The pilot and co-pilot sat in the cockpit. Farther back were the flight engineer, radio operator, ball turret gunner, 2 waist gunners, and tail gunner. The crew functioned as one system. A navigator's error could place everyone over the wrong target. Damage near the cockpit could kill men far behind it. A broken oxygen line could disable crewmen who appeared physically unhurt. A silent gun position could expose the entire aircraft to attack. The B-17 was called a flying fortress because of its heavy defensive armament. The name suggested safety, but a single bomber remained vulnerable. Its best protection came from formation flying. Aircraft were positioned so their guns could support one another. A fighter attacking one bomber might enter the firing range of several others. In theory, the formation created a moving wall of heavy machine gun fire. Maintaining that wall required discipline. Pilots had to hold close positions despite turbulence, anti-aircraft fire, mechanical problems, and the sight of damaged bombers falling nearby. During the final bomb run, formations often had to remain steady so bombardiers could aim accurately. A damaged bomber faced a dangerous choice. Remaining in formation might place too much strain on failing engines. Falling behind meant losing the defensive protection of the other aircraft. German fighter pilots understood this weakness. They attacked from several directions, searched for damaged aircraft, and attempted to separate vulnerable bombers from the group. They used speed, altitude, sunlight, cloud, and coordinated passes to reduce the effectiveness of American defensive fire. The Americans were learning while they fought. During the summer of 1943, long-range fighter escort remained limited. Republic P-47 Thunderbolts could protect the bombers during part of their journey, but they could not accompany every deep mission all the way to the target and back. When the escorts turned toward England, the bombers continued alone. For the crews, that moment carried a meaning no officer needed to explain. Their survival now depended on formation discipline, the strength of their aircraft, the decisions of their pilots, and the men behind the guns. Michael Aruth was one of those men. Born on July 31, 1919, he was still 23 when he boarded his aircraft on July 30, 1943. He would turn 24 the next day. Aruth served as a staff sergeant and tail gunner. The tail position was separated from the cockpit by much of the bomber's fuselage. He could not look forward and see the pilots. He depended on the interphone for warnings, reports, and commands. His principal weapons were two Browning .50 caliber machine guns. They were powerful, but aerial gunnery was far more difficult than firing at a stationary target. The fighter, bomber, and weapons were all moving. Range changed quickly. Angles shifted. The gunner had to estimate speed and lead while wearing thick clothing, gloves, goggles, an oxygen mask, and protective equipment. At combat altitude, temperatures could fall far below freezing. The aircraft vibrated around him. Tracers, sunlight, cloud, smoke, and the movement of other bombers complicated the view. Training taught a man to operate the weapon. Combat taught him how difficult it was to survive long enough to use it well. Aruth became an exceptional gunner. Later records credited him with at least 17 enemy aircraft during 14 combat missions, an extraordinary official total for a bomber crewman. Yet his value could not be measured only by confirmed victories. A tail gunner did not need to destroy every fighter he engaged. He needed to disrupt the enemy pilot's aim. A fighter forced to turn, climb, dive, or fire too early had failed to make an accurate attack. Aruth's task was not simply to collect victories. It was to keep his crew alive. On July 30, 1943, that responsibility became more important than his own safety. The Kassel mission, the target, lay near Kassel in central Germany. The city and its surrounding industrial districts supported the German aircraft industry. American bombers were ordered to strike facilities connected with the Fieseler works, including aircraft component and assembly plants. For the crews, the description on the briefing map meant a long flight through defended airspace. More than 180 B-17s were dispatched toward targets in the Kassel area that day. The force flew in separate formations and attacked different parts of the industrial complex. Michael Aruth was flying aboard a B-17F named Mystic, serial number 425820. This detail matters because later retellings often placed him aboard another aircraft, Tondelayo. Aruth did fly with the crew associated with Tondelayo, and he would later survive that bomber's final mission. But the action for which he received the Distinguished Service Cross occurred aboard Mystic on July 30. Before takeoff, the airfield followed its familiar routine. Ammunition belts were loaded, guns were checked, oxygen connections were examined, parachutes and emergency gear were placed within reach. The pilots reviewed the weather, route, fuel requirements, target, bomb load, and formation position. There was little need for dramatic speeches. The crews understood the danger. They had seen bombers return with wounded men aboard. They had watched empty positions appear in formations. They knew that someone who ate breakfast beside them might be missing by evening. The engines started one after another. Each B-17 had 4 Wright Cyclone radial engines. When an entire group prepared for departure, the combined noise shook the ground. Propeller wash moved grass, dust, exhaust, and loose equipment across the field. Heavy with fuel and bombs, the aircraft began taking off. After leaving Kimballton, the bombers gathered into formation. Aircraft circled assembly points and joined their squadrons. Squadrons joined larger formations. Pilots adjusted altitude and spacing until the organization drawn on a briefing room board became real in the sky. From the tail, Aruth watched other bombers settle into position. He saw wings moving slightly as pilots corrected for turbulence. He recognized markings on tails and fuselages. When the aircraft were close enough, he could see other men at waist windows and gun positions. Eventually, the force turned toward occupied Europe. Below lay the English Channel. Beyond it were fields, railways, roads, rivers, towns, factories, and defended airfields. As the bombers climbed, the men connected their oxygen systems. The air grew colder. Frost formed on windows and metal. Heated clothing became essential. Escort fighters remained with the formation during part of the flight. Then, limited by fuel and range, they turned back. The bombers continued east. Aruth kept watching the sky behind them. Enemy aircraft could first appear as tiny points. Experience was required to distinguish fighters from reflections or distant bombers. Then, the points began moving into organized positions. They climbed, circled, or gathered for attacks. Warnings passed through the interphone. German fighters were approaching. The gunners prepared. The official Distinguished Service Cross citation, later described the attacking force as large and its assaults as determined. Those words were formal and restrained. Inside Mystic, there was nothing restrained about the battle. German fighters approached from several directions. Some attacks developed rapidly, leaving only seconds between the warning and the firing pass. Others began with aircraft maneuvering outside effective range while searching for an advantage. From the tail, Aruth watched the rear sector. His position gave him a direct view of fighters approaching from behind, but that did not mean he controlled the engagement. Parts of the B-17 created blind areas. A fighter could use sunlight, cloud, speed, or the confusion of simultaneous attacks to reduce his reaction time. Aruth fired. The twin 5.0 caliber guns hammered inside the narrow compartment. Their recoil vibrated through the mounts and into his arms. Tracers reached across the distance toward the enemy aircraft. He adjusted his aim. The fighter crossed his line of fire. Aruth continued tracking until it turned away, disappeared beneath the bomber, began smoking, or broke apart. The official record credited him with destroying 3 enemy aircraft during the first phase of the fighting. Confirming aerial victories was difficult. Several gunners might fire at the same fighter. An aircraft seen diving could recover at a lower altitude. Smoke did not always mean destruction. Claims were reviewed using witness statements and other available evidence. The precise sequence of Aruth's first 3 victories cannot be reconstructed with certainty. What is known is that he was still defending Mystic when a German cannon shell exploded near his position. Enemy fighters carried weapons capable of causing far greater damage than ordinary machine gun bullets. A 20-millimeter shell could penetrate or explode against the bomber, sending fragments through aluminum skin, wiring, oxygen lines, equipment, clothing, and flesh. The explosion changed everything around Aruth. One gun was jammed or rendered unusable, his normal oxygen line was severed, his interphone stopped working. Fragments wounded him badly, shattering and bleeding his leg. Within seconds, the tail position became isolated from the rest of the crew. Aruth could no longer speak to the cockpit. The pilots could not ask whether he remained conscious. He could not report his injury, the broken oxygen connection, or the disabled gun. At high altitude, losing oxygen was a serious emergency, even for an uninjured man. Hypoxia did not always arrive with a clear warning. A man might become strangely calm. His judgment could weaken. His hands might lose coordination. His vision could narrow. He might fail to recognize that he was approaching unconsciousness. Aruth needed emergency oxygen. He attempted to reach it. At nearly the same time, Mystic's pilot began violent evasive action. The bomber moved so suddenly that several crewmen believed it was falling out of control. They bailed out. From their positions, they could not know everything happening in the cockpit. They felt the aircraft turning or dropping. Damage to the oxygen system may have affected their judgment. In the noise and confusion, the bomber's movements appeared to mean that the pilots had lost control. The men jumped over enemy territory. They survived their parachute descents, but became prisoners of war. Aruth remained in the tail. He may not have known exactly who had left. His interphone no longer worked, and he could not confirm what was happening elsewhere. He now faced a decision. He could continue trying to reach emergency oxygen. That offered his best chance of remaining conscious. It might also allow him to examine or control the bleeding from his shattered leg. But German fighters were still attacking. Every moment away from the gun left Mystic's tail undefended. Aruth abandoned the attempt to reach emergency oxygen. He returned to his position. Only one gun remained usable. He fired it. The last gun, the story, does not require invented dialogue. There is no need to imagine Aruth announcing that he would stay at his post. No one could hear him because the interphone was dead. His decision was expressed through action. He returned to the surviving weapon and placed himself back in the position most exposed to another rear attack. He searched the sky. Pain, blood loss, cold, and oxygen deprivation worked against every movement. A shattered leg could not simply be ignored. Even if the injury did not prevent him from firing, it reduced his ability to brace himself, change position, and reach equipment. Yet the fighters continued attacking. Aruth fired the remaining gun. 1.50 caliber weapon produced less firepower than the normal pair, but it could still damage or destroy an enemy aircraft. More importantly, its tracers showed the German pilots that the tail remained defended. A silent tail invited a direct attack. A firing tail forced the enemy pilot to consider the risk. Elsewhere in Mystic, the pilots fought to keep the bomber controllable. Other crewmen dealt with damaged equipment, missing men, and the demands of remaining airborne. The engines had to continue running. Fuel had to reach them. Control cables and surfaces had to remain intact. Fire, structural failure, or another cannon burst could still destroy the aircraft. At the rear, Aruth fought a separate battle. Then his final gun jammed. Both tail weapons were now out of action. He was wounded. He had no normal oxygen supply. His communications were gone. Under those conditions, No reasonable officer could have accused him of failing his duty if he had stopped. But the gun was not necessarily destroyed. A machine gun could jam because of a cartridge, belt, link feeding problem, cold, damage, or the violent movement of the bomber. Gunners were trained to clear stoppages. Training assumed the gunner could think, breathe, see, and move properly. Aruth began working on the malfunction. He had to identify the problem and manipulate the mechanism while wearing combat clothing and gloves inside a moving aircraft with a shattered leg and too little oxygen in his blood. He succeeded. The weapon returned to action. Another German fighter entered his field of fire. Aruth aimed and pulled the trigger. The official citation credited him with destroying a fourth enemy aircraft after clearing the jam. That fourth victory gave the engagement a clear numerical ending, but the number was not the most important result. Mystic remained airborne. The crewmen still aboard had a chance to return to England. Aruth helped give them that chance when he stopped searching for emergency oxygen and returned to the gun. Eventually, the attacks weakened. The bomber moved away from the most dangerous area. The surviving crew brought the damaged B-17 west. For Aruth, the return journey could not have felt safe. He still needed oxygen and medical treatment. His leg remained wounded. The cold remained. Mystic remained damaged. But the sky behind the bomber was no longer filled with attacking fighters. Eventually, the English coast appeared. Mystic returned to Britain. Only after landing could the full condition of the aircraft and crew be understood. The men learned who had bailed out. Medical personnel reached Aruth. Ground crews examined the damage. The mission had left 2 waist gunners as prisoners of war. It had damaged Mystic and seriously wounded its tail gunner. But the bomber had returned. The Distinguished Service Cross citation later praised Aruth's extraordinary heroism, skill, coolness, and disregard for his own safety. It did not claim that he invented a new gunnery doctrine. It did not say German intelligence knew him personally. It did not describe him defeating an official manual. It recorded something supported by evidence. Aruth destroyed 3 fighters before being wounded. Enemy fire disabled 1 gun, cut his oxygen line, destroyed his interphone, and shattered his leg. Several crewmen bailed out after mistaking evasive action for a loss of control. Aruth stopped trying to reach emergency oxygen, returned to his remaining weapon, and continued defending the aircraft. When that gun jammed, he repaired it. Then he destroyed a 4th fighter. Those facts required no exaggeration. Recovery and return to combat, the Distinguished Service Cross was one of the highest American awards for valor. The recommendation for Aruth moved through official channels while he recovered. The award was authorized in European Theater of Operations orders, dated September 10, 1943. The air war did not pause while paperwork moved. Missions continued. Crews were needed. Experienced gunners remained valuable. Aruth returned to combat duty. From a peaceful distance, that decision may seem difficult to understand. He had already survived an exploding cannon shell, a shattered leg, failed communications, lost oxygen, and 2 disabled guns. Yet many airmen returned to the same positions after injury and terror. Duty was one reason. Loyalty to the crew was another. A bomber crew trained, traveled, flew, and survived together. Each man's work protected the others. Leaving combat duty could mean leaving men with whom he had shared experiences that people outside the aircraft could not fully understand. There was also the larger machinery of the campaign. Aircraft were repaired, replacement men arrived. New targets appeared on briefing room maps. By late August and early September 1943, the 8th Air Force was still trying to prove that Heavily armed bomber formations could strike deep targets in daylight. The campaign had already produced terrible losses. German defenses remained powerful. An adequate long-range fighter escort was not yet available for the deepest operations. The B-17 was durable, but durability did not make it invulnerable. Some bombers returned with extraordinary damage. Others exploded, broke apart, burned, or fell from formation. Some remained controllable long enough for their crews to jump. Others carried men almost home before failing. Aruth joined the crew of 2nd Lieutenant Bon Edgar Fox, Jr. Fox piloted a B-17F named Tondelayo, serial number 42-29896. The aircraft carried the squadron code FOV and belonged to the 527th Bombardment Squadron. The crew included co-pilot Charles Malden, navigator Elmer Bendener, bombardier Robert Hageney, flight engineer Lawrence Reedman, radio operator Frederick Reinhard, ball turret gunner Walter Gray, waist gunners John Leary and Harry Edwards, and tail gunner Michael Aruth. Bendener would later write about his wartime experiences, helping preserve the memory of the crew and Tondelayo's final flight. Because Aruth flew aboard Tondelayo. Later accounts sometimes transferred his July 30 battle to that bomber. Historical accuracy requires separating the two missions. On July 30, Aruth earned the Distinguished Service Cross aboard Mystic during the Kassel mission. On September 6, he flew aboard Tondelayo during the mission to Stuttgart. The second mission produced a different struggle. Stuttgart, the operation, on September 6, 1943, was one of the 8th Air Force's major deep penetration missions. The target was the industrial area around Stuttgart, including facilities associated with Bosch and the production of components important to the German war economy. Hundreds of B-17s were dispatched, although not all reached or bombed the primary target. Weather, navigation problems, mechanical failures, form-in difficulties, fighter attacks, and anti-aircraft fire could scatter a force long before it arrived. The mission required a long flight. Fuel planning was critical. A B-17 could travel great distances, but its reserves could disappear because of headwinds, delays, evasive maneuvering, leaking tanks, damaged engines, or navigational errors. A bomber did not need to be destroyed directly by enemy fire to be lost. Combat could force it to burn the fuel needed to reach. Home before dawn at Kimballton, the men prepared again. Her aluminum skin showed the wear of combat, repairs, scratches, stains, and patches applied by ground crews who treated each bomber as an individual machine. Aruth returned to the tail. The equipment was familiar, but familiarity could not erase the memory of July 30. He knew what cannon fire could do to guns, oxygen lines, communications, and the human body. The crew boarded. The engine started. Tondelayo taxied with the other B-17s and took off into the early morning. The bombers assembled and turned toward Europe. Escort fighters joined them for part of the route. Below, the landscape passed through morning haze. Inside Tondelayo, Ben Diner worked at his navigator's station. Wind could move the formation away from its intended route. Clouds could hide landmarks. Small errors could grow across hundreds of miles. Fox and Malden kept the aircraft in formation. They had to fly close enough to receive protection without colliding with another bomber. Propeller wash and turbulence moved the aircraft. Every correction affected fuel consumption. The force continued toward Stuttgart. German fighters attacked. Anti-aircraft batteries waited around defended areas. Formations became strained as aircraft suffered damage and mechanical problems. Aruth watched the rear and fired when necessary. But the documented drama of this mission was not another 4-victory battle. It was the gradual destruction of Tondelao's ability to return safely to England. The bomber consumed fuel at a dangerous rate. Evasive action increased that consumption. Changes in altitude, speed, and formation position added to the problem. The long journey to Stuttgart and back already left little room for error. Tondelayo also suffered combat damage. Her radio was put out of action. Co-pilot Charles Malden was wounded in the leg. Navigator Elmer Bendener was wounded as well. The aircraft's condition became increasingly uncertain as the crew turned west. The bombing force no longer resembled the organized formation that had left England. Some aircraft remained together. Others fell behind. Smoke marked damaged engines. Empty spaces showed where bombers had been. Parachutes appeared beneath aircraft that could no longer continue. The men aboard Tondelayo understood the arithmetic. Every mile required fuel. Every evasive movement required fuel. Every rough-running engine threatened to consume more fuel or stop entirely. England remained far away. The English Channel on the return flight, Tondelayo's fuel gauges continued moving toward empty. Bendiner calculated their position and course. Fawkes and Malden tried to preserve what fuel remained. The safest outcome would have been a landing at another British airfield. First, however, they had to cross the English Channel. A B-17 without engine power could glide, but the heavy bomber lost altitude steadily. The crew's options depended on height, weather, distance from land, and the aircraft's condition. As the English coast drew closer, hope and danger increased together. Home was near enough to imagine. It was not near enough to guarantee survival. The engines began failing from fuel starvation. One after another, their power disappeared. Tondelayo became a massive glider descending over the channel. Fawkes prepared to ditch. A water landing in a B-17 was extremely dangerous. If one wing struck first, the aircraft could turn violently. If the nose dug into a wave, the fuselage could break apart. Equipment and ammunition could tear loose. Even after a survivable impact, the bomber might sink quickly. The crew secured themselves, braced, and prepared emergency equipment. Injured men would need help. Aruth remained in the tail, far from the cockpit and vulnerable during the impact. Outside, waves moved beneath the descending bomber. Wind marked the water with whitecaps. Fawkes judged direction, speed, and the shape of the sea. There would be no second attempt. Tondelayo descended. The water rose. The bomber struck the English Channel. The impact threw men against straps, equipment, and metal. Water entered the aircraft. In the tail, Aruth struck his head against the gun mount or nearby structure and suffered another wound. The crew escaped the damaged bomber and entered life rafts. All 10 men survived the ditching. Behind them, Tondelayo settled into the water. The bomber that had carried them to Stuttgart and almost back to Britain was beyond saving. Water filled the fuselage. Tondelayo disappeared into the channel. 6 hours at sea surviving, the impact did not mean the men were safe. The channel was cold. The crew was injured, exhausted, wet, and separated from land by open water. The damage to Tondelayo's radio had limited communication before the ditching. Rescue crews knew American bombers were returning, but locating a small raft remained difficult. The men waited for roughly 6 hours. In a mission report, 6 hours is a simple measurement. For wounded men in a life raft, it is an enormous amount of time. Aruth's head injury bled. Malden and Bendiner had been wounded during the mission. Cold worked through wet clothing. Waves repeatedly lifted and dropped the rafts. The men watched the horizon. An aircraft might pass without seeing them. A vessel could appear and disappear behind waves. Every distant sound demanded attention. Inside Tondelayo, each man had served at a specialized station. In the rafts, No officer's rank or gunner's skill could make rescue arrive sooner. There were only 10 men, the sea, and the hope that someone was searching. Eventually, a British air-sea rescue launch found them. The vessel approached and took the survivors aboard. Only then did Tondelayo's final mission end. All 10 men survived. The bomber remained beneath the channel. The July 30 heroism belonged to Aruth aboard Mystic. The September 6 ditching belonged to the entire crew aboard Tondelayo. Keeping those stories separate does not weaken either one. It allows both to be remembered honestly. The truth that remains historical stories do not become weaker when invented details are removed. They become more meaningful. Michael Aruth did not need to be transformed into a lone rebel fighting foolish officers and a deadly manual. He did not need German commanders to know his name. He did not need a secret firing technique. His real achievement required no invention. On July 30, 1943, while serving as tail gunner aboard Mystic during a mission against targets near Kassel, Aruth destroyed 3 enemy aircraft before a German cannon shell wounded him. The explosion disabled 1 gun. His oxygen supply failed. His interphone stopped working. His leg was shattered and bleeding. Several crewmen, believing the bomber was out of control, bailed out over enemy territory. Aruth stopped trying to reach emergency oxygen. He returned to the remaining gun. Then that weapon jammed. He repaired it while wounded and deprived of oxygen. He resumed firing. He destroyed a 4th enemy fighter. A little more than 5 weeks later, he flew aboard Tondelayo during the mission to Stuttgart. That bomber ran out of fuel on the return flight and ditched in the English Channel. All 10 men survived. These were not about invincible machines. Mystic was damaged. Tondelayo was lost. The men were wounded, confused, exhausted, and afraid. They survived because individuals continued working after the situation had passed every reasonable expectation of safety. Pilots held damaged aircraft in the air. Navigators continued calculating routes. Injured crewmen helped one another. Rescue crews searched the channel. And in the tail, Michael Aruth stayed with his guns. He did not need to defeat a manual. He needed to clear a jam. No legend is required. The truth is enough.